At the school entrance, an unexpected scene froze hearts. The girl with an old dress and worn backpack waited in silence, while her mother, radiant in a red dress, proudly adjusted new clothes for her older son. The little one lowered her gaze, swallowing tears, invisible to those who should love her. What was about to happen would not only put into question that mother's justice, but also the true value of the word family. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. And before we continue, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The bustle of the Sunday farmers' market extended throughout the town. Under the stone arches, the stalls offered vivid colors. Piles of gleaming oranges, artisan cheeses hanging like treasures, hand-knitted wool scarves. The smell of freshly fried funnel cakes mixed with the aroma of coffee coming from the corner cafe. It was a fall day, dry leaves rolled with the wind and families strolled wrapped in coats. Carmen walked confidently among the stalls with her head held high, carefully looking for a shirt for her older son. Diego, 12 years old, followed her enthusiastically, knowing that day he would leave with something new. Antonio, the father, carried a bag of potatoes and remained silent as usual, observing without expressing too much opinion. At his side, little Maria tried to keep pace in a dress that had already passed through several hands of cousins and neighbors. The fabric was worn, the colors faded, the seams mended over and over again. At a nearby stand, a red dress hung in view of everyone. Maria looked at it with hope. She raised her hand to touch the soft fabric, imagining herself wearing it at school, imagining what it would be like to feel pretty, even if just for one day. The girl smiled timidly, but immediately heard her mother's voice. "That's not necessary, dear. You still have your cousins," Carmen said, pushing the fabric aside with a quick gesture. The vendor, meanwhile, praised Diego. "This boy has presence, ma'am. With this new shirt, he'll look like a real gentleman." The boy, proud, tried on the blue garment and looked at himself in a small mirror hanging from the stand. Antonio observed the scene in silence. His gaze stopped for an instant on Maria, who had withdrawn her hand from the red dress. He said nothing, perhaps to avoid an argument. Perhaps because deep down he was accustomed to his wife's way of being. The market's murmur continued. Children's laughter, vendors' voices offering olives, music from a street accordion. Diego turned around on himself, showing off the new shirt, and Carmen smiled satisfied. "That's right, son. That's right." Maria lowered her eyes, pressing her lips together. She felt the fall wind's cold seep through the holes in her dress. She hugged herself, pretending nothing was wrong. But inside her the question grew. Why was she always the one who received the leftovers? Antonio, with a furrowed brow, tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He walked behind his family with slow steps. The echo of shoes on the cobblestones seemed to remind him that silence was also a choice. Maria, on the other hand, tried to convince herself that perhaps someday things would be different, that maybe her mother would look at her with the same pride she looked at Diego. The sun began to hide behind the red tile roofs. The merchants gathered their stalls, putting away tablecloths and fabrics. The family headed back home with Diego displaying his new shirt like a trophy. Maria walked behind, dragging her feet slightly with a heavy heart. That night, in front of the mirror, Maria caressed her old dress and thought, "Why do I always receive the leftovers?" The school playground was full of children's voices. It was mid-morning. The air smelled of ham sandwiches wrapped in paper and worn chalk that teachers still used on the green blackboards. Children ran after a ball. Others played hopscotch drawn with chalk on the stone floor. Maria walked slowly, trying to blend in with the others, wishing to go unnoticed. Her dress, the same one she had worn at the market on Sunday, showed open seams and a worn edge that barely covered her knees. A group of girls approached her with malicious smiles. One of them, with a new bow in her hair, pointed at the dress and said loudly, "Look, it looks like a kitchen rag." The laughter spread like fire. Some children turned around, others joined in with mocking gestures. Maria felt the ground open beneath her feet. She tried to cover herself with her hands, gathering the fabric forward, but the more she did it, the more visible the stains and loose threads seemed. Her heart beat hard, her eyes filled with tears. Diego, who was playing soccer with his friends at the other end of the playground, heard the laughter, but pretended not to hear. A pang of discomfort ran through his chest, though he kept running after the ball as if nothing was happening. Suddenly, a firm voice cut through the air. "Enough already," exclaimed Mrs. Isabel, the teacher who had come out to the playground with a gray coat over her shoulders. The murmur ceased. The children looked at each other and lowered their heads. Isabel approached Maria and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. The girl trembled, unable to hold her gaze. "Maria," the teacher said in a low voice, just for her, "don't let anyone make you feel less." The girl nodded, though tears already ran down her cheeks. She clung to Isabel's arm like someone finding refuge in the midst of a storm. The teacher hugged her for a few seconds, protecting her from the others' gazes. Later in class, Isabel couldn't fully concentrate on the lesson. While the children copied a reading, she observed Maria, who wrote with her head lowered, striving not to stand out. Isabel knew that silence, the one of students who carried something heavier than a backpack. When the final bell rang, the children ran out. Some said goodbye with a "see you tomorrow." Others left in groups toward the square. Maria gathered her notebooks carefully and left last. Outside, Antonio, her father, waited for her, sitting on a bench with his hands in his pockets. He gave her a light pat on the back and they walked together in silence. Isabel watched them from the door. Her teacher's instinct told her it wasn't enough to console Maria at recess. There was something deeper behind that old dress, something that came from home. She decided she couldn't ignore it. That same afternoon, when the classrooms were empty and the echo of footsteps faded, Isabel took her coat, put some papers in her bag, and left heading to the family's house. That afternoon, Isabel took her coat and thought, "I'll speak with her parents. This can't continue like this." The afternoon settled slowly over the town, and the fresh fall air made dry branches creak. The sky was tinged with gray, foreboding rain, while a heavy silence dominated Maria's parents' house. The whitewashed walls reflected a dim light, and the wall clock marked the passage of minutes with its constant tick-tock. Antonio leafed through an old newspaper at the dining room table, but his eyes were lost among the letters, incapable of concentrating. Carmen moved pots and plates, murmuring about dinner with quick, dry gestures. Maria was in her room drawing in a notebook with short pencils, seeking refuge in colors that barely remained. Some knocks on the door interrupted the routine. Antonio got up reluctantly and opened. There stood Isabel, the teacher, wrapped in her gray coat with a folder under her arm and a serious expression. She greeted with a good afternoon, charged with respect, and asked permission to enter. Carmen raised her eyebrows, surprised by the unexpected visit, but couldn't refuse. With a rigid smile, she invited her to come in. The dining room smelled of half-made stew. Isabel sat at the table facing Antonio and Carmen, who positioned themselves one on each side. The tension could be cut with a knife. Maria, hearing the voices, tiptoed out of her room and stayed in the hallway, hidden behind the door with her heart beating fast. "I've come because I'm worried about Maria," Isabel began with a soft but firm voice. "Today at recess, some children made fun of her dress. She cried and I had to intervene." Antonio shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Carmen, on the other hand, responded coldly. "They're kid things. We've all had something said to us at some point." Isabel looked her in the eyes and replied, "It's not the same. A comment can pass, but when a child feels inferior in her own home, that wound becomes deep." Carmen crossed her arms defensively. "Diego is the oldest. He needs to make a good impression. Maria is a girl. It's fine if she dresses simply. I grew up like that and I haven't lacked anything." Maria pressed her lips together from the hallway, her eyes filled with tears hearing those words. Isabel rested her hands on the table, leaning slightly forward. "It's not just about clothes. It's about what it means to her. She always receives the leftovers. She'll believe her place in the world is that, someone who doesn't deserve the best." Antonio looked up. His eyes revealed an internal conflict. He wanted to speak, but Carmen interrupted him with a hand gesture, as if ordering him to be silent. The teacher sighed and continued, this time with a harder tone. "Children don't forget indifference. Perhaps they'll forget a punishment or a harsh word, but they never forget feeling less loved." Silence fell over the table. Only the kitchen faucets dripping and the wind hitting the shutters could be heard. Isabel looked at Antonio with hope, waiting for him to say something, but he lowered his eyes, incapable of confronting his wife. That silence weighed as much as a confession. Maria, hidden, felt loneliness take hold of her. She wanted to run to Isabel, hug her, ask her not to leave, but fear of her mother's reaction nailed her to the floor. Finally, Isabel gathered her folder and stood up. "I just wanted you to think about it. Maria deserves the same as Diego. No more, no less," she said firmly. Carmen nodded with a courteous smile, though her eyes said otherwise. Antonio murmured a thank you, barely audible. The teacher walked toward the door and before leaving turned for an instant. "Don't underestimate the wound that indifference leaves." The door closed and the blow's echo resonated in the house. Carmen returned to the kitchen without saying a word. Antonio went out to the patio and lit a cigarette, looking at the cloudy sky with a tormented expression. In the hallway, Maria remained still with her gaze fixed on the floor. Her lips trembled, and in an almost inaudible whisper she said, "I wish someone would defend me in here." The sky had turned leaden, and the fall air announced a storm. When the dismissal bell rang at school, children ran toward the main square, some with umbrellas, others protecting themselves with folders over their heads. Maria had nothing to cover herself with. She left with her notebook pressed against her chest, and began walking through the cobblestone streets that already reflected puddles under the street lamps lit earlier than usual. The rain fell suddenly, first as a fine drizzle, then as a downpour. The drops hit hard on the old dress that soon stuck to her body. The cold got under her skin, making her shiver. Her shoes, too small and with worn soles, let water in until her socks were soaked. The girl gritted her teeth and walked faster, wanting to get home. Diego had left a few minutes later, accompanied by 2 friends. He ran laughing, protecting himself under a store awning. In an instant, he distinguished his sister's silhouette advancing alone under the rain. He saw her hunched, with the dark dress stuck to her body and hair dripping. For the first time, something inside him contracted. It wasn't fair. His friends called him to continue playing in the puddles, but Diego didn't respond. He stood watching how Maria turned the corner toward home. At home, Carmen looked up from the kitchen upon hearing the door burst open. Maria entered trembling, the dress soaked, her hands cold as ice. "Change your clothes," the mother said without raising her voice too much, busy stirring a stew. Maria nodded silently and went up to her room. She climbed the stairs with her shoes dripping water, leaving a wet trail. Nobody followed her. Nobody offered her a blanket or a hug. Diego arrived shortly after. He found the house warm from the kitchen fire, but his gaze immediately sought his sister. He heard a door slam upstairs and knew she was locked in her room. He wanted to go up, knock, say something, but didn't dare. He stayed in the hallway, squeezing the soccer ball against his chest, feeling a strange knot in his throat. At dinner, the family gathered around the table. The stew steamed and Carmen served the plates normally. Antonio spoke little, limited to comments about work. Diego played with his fork, distracted, while Maria barely tasted a bite. The silence weighed. Nobody mentioned the rain or the soaked dress. Antonio, upon looking up, noticed Maria's reddened cheeks and still damp hair. He made as if to ask, but restrained himself. Fear of an argument with Carmen closed his mouth. He only cleared his throat and continued eating. Maria, with her hands in her lap, tried not to let tears escape. She told herself she was already used to it. That's how things were in her house. But inside, the sadness grew like a shadow. Diego looked at her sideways. He remembered the laughter in the playground when children made fun of her. He remembered Isabel's visit to the house, and the teacher's words still resonating in his head. Don't underestimate the wound that indifference leaves. That phrase burned him. Though he hadn't heard it directly, it had reached him in comments among neighbors. After dinner, each one withdrew. Antonio went out to the patio to smoke. Carmen gathered the plates and hummed a distracted tune. Diego went up to his room with slow steps. He stopped in front of Maria's closed door. Behind it, a tense silence could be heard, and suddenly a contained sob. Diego pressed his ear to the wood, holding his breath. That night, Diego heard his sister cry softly and couldn't sleep. The afternoon sun entered through the school windows, tinting the stone hallways golden. It was parent-teacher meeting day, and the air was charged with murmurs and slight nervousness. The wooden benches had been aligned in the main classroom. On the walls hung colorful drawings made by the children, houses with red roofs, green fields and blue skies with birds. On the teacher's desk was a thermos with coffee and cookies that some parents shared while waiting. Carmen arrived first with a dark coat and her purse clutched under her arm. She walked with firm steps, though deep down she didn't enjoy wasting the afternoon at those meetings. Antonio followed her with a tired expression, hands in his pockets, avoiding looking too much at others. Maria, seated on a bench in the back, observed in silence. Nervous, she knew that afternoon could change something in her life, though she didn't understand how. Isabel, the teacher, stood up. Her clear voice filled the classroom. She began talking about the class's progress, how some children had improved in reading, others in math. Parents nodded. Some smiled proudly upon hearing their children's names. Diego was also mentioned. He has demonstrated leadership in games and responsibility with his tasks, Isabel said, looking at Carmen, who smiled pleased. But then Isabel stopped, looked at the name list and raised her voice with a special tone. I want to highlight a student who, despite difficulties, works with admirable perseverance. I'm talking about Maria. A murmur ran through the classroom. Carmen looked up, surprised. Antonio also turned his head toward his daughter, who blushed and lowered her gaze. Maria, Isabel continued, not only fulfills her duties, she also demonstrates a special sensitivity for details. Her compositions are profound, and in mathematics she has solved exercises that few achieve at her age. If she had the same opportunities as Diego, I'm convinced she would go even further. Some parents applauded softly. Others smiled toward Maria. The girl, who shrank on the bench as if wanting to disappear, raised her eyes for an instant. The gleam in her gaze said more than 1,000 words. Carmen felt an uncomfortable warmth in her chest. She didn't expect to hear those praises toward her younger daughter. She shifted in her seat and crossed her arms. Antonio, on the other hand, swallowed and shifted in his chair with a lump in his throat. Isabel continued calmly but firmly. Children flourish when they feel loved and valued. It's not enough to give them shelter and food. They need to feel seen. The phrase remained suspended in the air. The murmurs ceased. Parents kept silent, as if that sentence had touched something deep in everyone. Maria, in the back, felt for the first time that someone recognized her in front of everyone. It was as if the afternoon light entering through the window enveloped her, giving her a new brightness. Carmen looked away, uncomfortable. She thought about the red dress at the market, about the rain that had soaked her daughter, about the times she had said, "It's not necessary," without imagining what those words could provoke. Antonio passed his hand over his forehead, sweaty despite the fall cold. He wanted to speak, thank Isabel, but his voice broke, and he decided to remain silent. The meeting continued with other topics, but the echo of what was said about Maria remained engraved in the air. Parents began to stand up, chatting among themselves, congratulating Isabel for her dedication. Some approached Maria and told her, "Very good, little one," which made her blush even more. When they left to the street, the night's fresh air received them. Carmen walked in silence, clutching her purse against her chest. Antonio followed her with his hands buried in his pockets. Maria walked behind with short but light steps, feeling like she was floating. The square's murmur mixed with the street lamp's lights and the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby stand. But in Carmen's head, only Isabel's words resonated. Upon reaching the corner, she stopped for an instant, looking at the ground. She pressed her lips together, uncomfortable. Inside her arose a question she couldn't avoid. What if the teacher is right? Sunday dawned with a fresh air, but different from past weeks. The sun illuminated the town's red rooftops, and the breeze brought the smell of freshly baked bread from the corner bakery. It was market day, and the main square filled with voices, colors, aromas that enveloped everyone in a festive atmosphere. The church bells rang, marking noon mass, and vendors spread their tablecloths over long wooden tables. There were stands of bright fruits, aged cheeses, artisan hams hanging like trophies, and baskets full of seasoned olives. Carmen walked slowly, holding Maria's hand. That simple gesture surprised the girl, who looked at her with both suspicion and tenderness. Antonio, as always, carried the empty basket, though this time his steps weren't dragging but firm. Diego jumped at his side, excited by the music of an accordion player playing near the fountain, where several children danced with funnel cakes in hand. Upon reaching a clothing stand, Carmen stopped. The vendor greeted with a cheerful voice. "Good morning, ma'am. Today we have new merchandise, just arrived from Boston. The dresses hung aligned, each with vivid colors, some of thick wool for winter, others light with embroidered flowers designed for the upcoming holiday celebrations. Carmen bent down to her daughter's height and, looking her in the eyes, asked with a soft voice, "Which one do you like?" Maria remained motionless. It was the first time her mother had asked her that question. She felt a lump in her throat and hesitated to answer. Diego pushed her gently with his elbow, encouraging her. "Come on, Maria, choose one." The girl timidly raised her hand and pointed to a blue dress with flowers embroidered on the chest and a delicate bow at the waist. The vendor took it down carefully, as if understanding that instant had a special value. Maria held the garment in her hands, caressing the soft fabric, different from anything she had ever had before. Antonio took out his wallet and paid without haggling, which wasn't usual for him. The vendor, smiling, commented, "It will look beautiful on her, sir, I assure you." Carmen nodded, and Diego applauded enthusiastically. Maria entered behind the stand's improvised screen, and after a few minutes came out dressed in blue. The fall breeze moved the skirt, and the sun drew sparkles on the embroidered flowers. Maria looked at herself in a mirror hung with a rope, and upon seeing her reflection couldn't contain her tears. They weren't tears of shame like at school, they were tears of joy. For the first time she felt seen, valued, recognized. Passers-by who passed stopped. Some elderly women commented in low voices, "How pretty the girl looks." And an old man smiled with tenderness. Maria lowered her gaze, blushing, but her heart beat with a new strength. On the way back home, the atmosphere was different. Antonio, who usually walked in silence, hummed an old tune. Diego talked nonstop, imagining how his sister would debut the dress at the town's next celebration. Carmen, though quiet, held Maria's hand the entire way, as if wanting to recover lost time. That night the family gathered for dinner. The table was set with potato omelet, freshly made bread, and a small plate of ham that Antonio had bought as a detail. The smell filled the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, laughter occupied silence's place. Diego told a joke learned at school, and everyone laughed, even Carmen. Maria felt part of that laughter, part of the table, not an invisible ghost. After dinner, Carmen gathered the plates, and Antonio served a bit of wine in 2 glasses for the adults. Maria observed from her chair, still with the blue dress on, incapable of taking it off even though she was about to sleep. Diego looked at her with complicity and winked at her as if saying, "You deserve it." When everything was in order, Carmen approached her daughter. She looked at her for a long time with moistened eyes, and caressed her hair with a clumsy but sincere gesture. The girl looked up, surprised, searching in her mother's face for that usual hardness, but what she found was tenderness. Carmen breathed deeply, and with a trembling voice, pronounced some words that marked the end of a cycle and the beginning of another. "Forgive me, daughter. Sometimes parents also learn late. Sometimes the memories that remain most aren't the grand gestures, but those simple instants when someone finally looks at us with affection." The image of that girl debuting a blue dress in the middle of the market, with the fall wind caressing the fabric, becomes a symbol many of us can understand. And before continuing, I'd like to ask you, what are you listening to from your home? If this story has seemed beautiful to you, write the number 1 in the comments. If you believe it could have been told differently, press the number 0 and share your feelings. The lesson that emerges from this story is clear and profound. Sincere love, though it arrives late, can repair old wounds. We all deserve to be loved and recognized, regardless of whether we're the oldest or youngest, male or female. True wealth isn't measured in new shirts or expensive dresses, but in the justice and tenderness with which we treat those who share our table. And like a lamp lit in the window during the night, a simple gesture, a hug, a word of encouragement, an act of equality can guide us through life's darkest hallways. Perhaps upon hearing this story, you remember moments when you also witnessed favoritism or silences that hurt. Or perhaps you recall an unexpected caress that healed old wounds. Each family keeps its secrets and shadows, but also the possibility of reconciliation. What's important is to understand it's never too late to change, to learn, to take a step toward tenderness. Pause now. Think about your own table, your children, your grandchildren. Ask yourself if there's someone still waiting for a word from you, a show of affection that hasn't been given. And if this story has touched your heart, share it, because telling stories is also a way of embracing. Always remember that happiness lights up when we stop living only for ourselves and begin to live for others.